All right, I think we'll get started. So hello to everyone who's joining. I can see the numbers are slowly climbing. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. And thank you all for joining us. And welcome to the second Global FOREWARN meeting of 2023. Today we're focusing on anticipating conflict, displacement, and unrest. And it's great to see so many people already joining the call. So we are hoping to make this meeting as interactive as possible, as usual. So if you would like to please add your name, the organisation you work for, and the country you're joining us from into the chat, and just say hello. And also feel free to post questions and comments as we go along, but we'll also build in some time for questions, hopefully at the end of the call. Just onto the next slide, please, Ella. Thank you. So just a quick note on interpretation. If you would like to listen to the call today in French, that's possible. You can just go to the French interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen. If you select the French channel, the whole meeting will be live interpreted, so you can listen and also ask questions in French as well. To run through the agenda then quickly first, just hop onto that. Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Ella. First of all, we'll do a quick welcome. Then the first speaker that we have today will speak about a recent study from the OCHA Centre for Humanitarian Data on technical feasibility of predicting conflict for anticipatory action. We'll then hear from colleagues within START Network about previous experience of anticipating conflict, displacement and unrest through the START Fund, and also some recent research that's been done around different tools and approaches that can be used for anticipating this type of hazard through the START Fund. And then we're hoping to hear from colleagues from the Anticipation Hub's conflict working group with 2 models for displacement due to conflict. And then hopefully, as I say, we will have time for questions at the end. Those of you who've joined before will be very familiar with this slide. I do speak to it every time. Just a quick overview of FOREWARN, what it is and how it's structured, for anyone who's not familiar. FOREWARN is the forecast-based warning, analysis and response network. And it's a network of experts. That's one strand of the anticipation service offer that's available to START Network members who are hoping to act earlier. So as we know, acting before a crisis happens can be uncertain and sometimes requires the expertise and advice of actors who don't traditionally work with humanitarians. So this network aims to bring together the right people to forecast hazards and to support humanitarians closest to an anticipated crisis. So FOREWARN was first established alongside the START Fund anticipation window in 2016, but also supports START Network members to act earlier through the START Ready mechanism as well. And we do have currently 5 national networks in Bangladesh, the Philippines, Madagascar, Nepal and Pakistan. And some colleagues from those countries are on the call today if you have any country-specific questions. And then finally, the hazard-specific thematic global subgroups have a technical advisory role to START Fund and START Ready. Applications to those groups are currently open, and I have a slide in a couple of minutes just with a bit more information about those. But first of all, just a reminder of who is in the FOREWARN team. So in Madagascar, we have Sahen. In Bangladesh, we have Ashraf, who's on the call today, and Leah in the Philippines, and then we also have Niraj in Nepal, and we're currently recruiting in the other 2 countries. And then, just to talk a little bit about the global expert groups and their relaunch. Obviously, following the call today, we will be calling for anybody with expertise in conflict and displacement, and particularly anticipating those hazards and forecasting those hazards. If anybody's interested in joining, then I can send through a bit more information if you just drop an email to forewarn@startprograms.org. But please do register your interest, even if this is not your area of expertise, and I'll reach out later in the year once we start launching the groups for other hazards. So with all that said, I'd like to hand over to our first speaker. So I believe, yeah, just checking everybody's on the line. So our first speaker is Seth Caldwell. Seth has over 7 years of experience in data and analytics in humanitarian response, and is a data scientist at the UN Centre for Humanitarian Data, working with the Predictive and Analytics team to develop triggers and to manage the technical work for OCHA's anticipatory pilots. So last year, Seth led the Centre's work in exploring the potential of conflict prediction models for anticipatory humanitarian action, and has kindly agreed to present some of the findings from that study today. So Seth, if you're there, over to you, please. Thanks.
Hi, Millie. Thanks very much, and excited to be here today, and to hopefully in the next couple hours also see all the work that you guys on the FOREWARN side are doing. But as Millie said, I will briefly present this research project that I've been working on, and I think you can go to the next slide. So what we do at the Center for Humanitarian Data, which you guys are also very familiar with, is of course mainly working on anticipatory action, and we've been doing pilots on epidemiological phenomena like cholera, like the plague. We've been doing it on floods and droughts, and we wanted to see last year, can we do something similar on conflict? And our idea is, essentially, can we replicate this model where we're looking at the early warning signs, and can we use these signals available to trigger our aid early? I mean, again, I'm not going to go into the details here of anticipatory action. You guys are very familiar with it. But what I do want to highlight, and if you go to the next slide, is our approach from the OCHA Centre for Humanitarian Data. As a global organization, we're working with the Central Emergency Response Fund to do global funding allocations for extreme out of the ordinary events. So ones that might only occur every 3, 5, even 20 years. So we're not working at the country level because we're a very small team. We don't have the resources to do that. So we're not doing it on maybe, a seasonal flare up in conflict. We're interested in, can we predict really these large scale onsets or escalations that are extremely critical for sort of country crisis, and making sure that we can, as a global actor, respond effectively. And this is what we've done on drought and on floods, really only looking at really large scale out of the ordinary events like we saw in flooding in South Sudan I worked on last year, and in drought in the Sahel or in the Horn now. Can we do that for conflict? And of course, again, what we do is a very kind of rigorous approach that I'd be interested to see how this matches up with the anticipatory approaches done by FOREWARN. But we take this kind of robust forecast, whatever it might be, and that is the model that will trigger the release of funding, but also having pre-agreed operational plans and pre-agreed financing to fund these operations all set in place, which means that once sort of thresholds hit, we can go forward and we can act. So if you go to the next slide, please. When I talk about assessing conflict in the feasibility of technically predicting it, it's really at this scale for this use case. And I'm not saying you can't or can do it on something like risk analysis or DRR or maybe other applications of conflict prediction. But anyways, we wanted to assess conflict because we know it's essentially very clear that conflict is the main driver of humanitarian need. And so last year, I did this research to try and assess basically its feasibility for conflict prediction. And if you go to the next slide, I'll just get right into the results. Again, just clarifying here, feasibility of applying conflict prediction models for anticipatory action, and not again for these other purposes. So not obviating other work that might be out there and we might want to do. So if you go to the next slide, getting to the bottom line, we saw issues in doing conflict prediction in the same way that we might do flood prediction or drought prediction. And there's really 3 just key reasons for this. Number one, there's poor performance in predicting kind of the onset of new conflicts. So while sometimes we might have circumstances where, for instance, Ukraine, or when Mosul was under siege, about 5-6 years ago, we have the ability to see an escalation or an onset in the future. It's often the case that the onsets are much more difficult to predict and to see, especially in contexts where there's not a history of conflict. And in these circumstances, the performance of kind of global models that we've assessed from some of the teams at Views and PRIO, from the teams at ACLID, Water, Peace and Security had a research project also trying to do these kinds of conflict predictions. We found that it really failed to predict the onset of new conflicts. At the same time, predicting conflict isn't something that, at least from the OCHA side, is directly operationally useful, right? Like, we are acting in response to floods or in response to drought because we want to alleviate the future impacts that this will have on populations. And when we know that a flood's going to, be extremely large and with a wide inundation area, we know the actions we need to take fairly clearly, because we know where populations are going to be flooded out of their homes. We can provide aid to them earlier. Maybe it's a cash transfer. Maybe it's providing flood kits early. With conflict, it's a lot less clear, just because we know, even if we knew where conflict was, exactly what the humanitarian impacts would be, especially at this kind of global approach that we're taking. And so there's this lack of clear connection between predicted conflict, even if we could do it well, and the resulting impact means that the kind of modeling approach we take would be very difficult. And then lastly, ongoing conflict in all of these modeling exercises is the really key predictor of future conflict. It really drives most of the model performance. And because of that, since we're not able to predict onset or escalation very well at a global level, we found that it's a much more efficient system would be to simply respond to populations currently impacted by conflict, would likely be, just as efficient as trying to predict where the next ones go out. And you'll most likely reach those populations that are likely going to be impacted by conflict in the future. And that we all know that there's already a dearth of funding and resources for humanitarian operations globally. And so we didn't think that, because of this poor performance and knowing where a new conflict might come in, and because we can just continue to respond in kind of a traditional manner, let's say, at least responding to where we know needs arise, there's no real justification for trying to expand beyond that at this kind of, global level. So if you go to the next slide, please. Essentially, we've thought, there's not really a use for conflict prediction in anticipatory action, but we also wanted to not, close the door. And I'm interested to hear today what sort of more localized and, targeted approaches look like in terms of anticipatory action for conflict. Because we think there is a lot of value in terms of using local resources from as data inputs to predicting conflict and its resultant impact, and to be able to integrate kind of predictions of conflict into predictions or anticipatory action on other phenomena. So, if you have a drought model or you're looking at flooding, it's a lot, there's a lot of use if you were able to know also how these flood dynamics or drought dynamics or, public health issues relate to conflict in these contexts. And we hope, and really our encouragement in the paper was that these more targeted approaches might show value and also might present a way forward as we try and plan and develop and slowly grow anticipatory approaches at sort of a global level for conflict. And if you go to the next slide, please. And so where we see the real potentials for conflict prediction and anticipatory action was also, we don't necessarily have to predict it. We tried, for instance, to predict dry spells in Malawi, and we found that it was almost impossible to forecast dry spells, even with some of the best climate models out there. But you could still observe them. So we were able to monitor if a dry spell had occurred, and you were still able to act earlier before a potential failed harvest, for instance. And so you could use observed conflict and anticipatory action in a sort of similar manner. So for us, it would still provide the benefits of having streamlined operations and, funding streams agreed and in place. And that sort of speed of response would still be there if it was, designed around just a monitoring of the conflict context. We still question, how to generate predictions of impact, but we hope that there's, again, potentials in using, local expertise and knowledge from partners, from local governments, from community actors that could relate these observations of conflict to humanitarian impact. That would be really valuable in kind of starting the approach and doing anticipatory action on conflict. And if you go to the next slide, please. Our overall recommendations, fairly simple, where we think it's really difficult to do anticipatory action, but we see, there are some avenues for potential opportunities, and that's for kind of access doing the actual work. From our side as kind of a more research approach, we're hoping to look at some of the best examples on the ground of modeling that's been used for anticipatory action on conflict, but also maybe for disaster risk reduction or preparedness efforts, or any other approaches that try and take a more quantitative or even kind of qualitative approach to predicting conflict, and see how those could have a potential for scaling up. When we see benefits as well from integrating conflict into anticipatory action approaches for any other phenomena if you're in a conflict setting. So making sure that conflict is taken into account when we're doing, floods or droughts or any of the other more standard, let's say, AA approaches. And remember, I'm not precluding any use of conflict predictions or the use of data for many other uses, peace building, conflict sensitive programming. There's loads and loads of, potential for doing, kind of conflict work with this data. And while issues still exist, we didn't assess any of these use cases. So it's really important to make sure that, to know what we're not precluding or we're not recommending against. And if you go to the next slide, I believe that is it from me. So I'd just like to say thank you to everyone, and just to add that I'm really interested in hearing all of the different approaches that you guys kind of undertake from FOREWARN, and I hope to hear from you. Please do reach out if you'd like to discuss what we've been doing, and I hope to enjoy you guys later. I'll be back to present some of the AA and working group stuff later, so I will remain on the call and available to chat.
Thank you so much, Seth. We do have a couple of minutes if anybody has any immediate burning questions, but otherwise please do feel free to put those into the chat. And yeah, thank you so much for giving such a comprehensive overview in such a short space of time. That's no mean feat. So thank you for that. And thanks also for kind of opening the door into thinking about some of those different ways of using different indicators for acting earlier in conflict situations. I think that leads nicely into our next speaker. So as by way of introduction, last year the START Network commissioned a research piece in some ways inspired and based on the report that Seth just gave an overview of. And the research piece was aiming to evaluate the different tools and approaches to anticipatory action for conflict through the START Fund. So I'm now handing over to Ed Parkinson, who is a technical advisor in the Crisis Anticipation and Risk Financing team here at START Network. And Ed will summarise how the START Fund has been used for anticipation of conflict and, or more, as you say, Seth, the impacts of conflict, so displacement and unrest as well as the guidance package resulting from the consultancy. So Ed, over to you. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Millie. Yeah, so I am going to present those pieces that Millie said, but just to say, a fair amount of this analysis was done by Christine, our anticipation meal advisor. So kudos to her for setting me up with all the analysis to do so. I think a relevant thing to say before we begin is, yeah, I mean, in line with Seth's findings and the report from OCHA and the work that the other actors like the Climate Centre are doing as well, has informed kind of the way that START Network approaches anticipatory action for conflict. Our Start Ready system, our Start Ready financing mechanism, which you might have heard about previously, hasn't had any examples of anticipatory action for conflict. We've not attempted to set up any systems for anticipatory action for conflict for Start Ready, and that is the system, the financing mechanism, which is based on modelling and setting triggers. So very much in line with those 3 pillars that Seth mentioned that the SURF uses around anticipatory action, are the same as those ones for Start Ready. We see them also in IFRC's DREF and the work that other actors like FAO and WFP do. So yeah, we haven't seen any examples of anticipatory action attempt to be modelled and do that kind of traditional forecast-based financing approach or anticipatory action approach. But what I'm going to be speaking about is where we do have examples of anticipatory action around conflict at Start Network, which is through the Start Fund. So the Start Fund being, the financing mechanism Start has, where the analysis is a lot more dynamic. Alerts can be raised on risk analysis that is done just beforehand. It doesn't have to be based on prediction models. It can be based on different types of informal and formal data analysis. Great, let's go in. So in total, 236 alerts have been raised to the Start Fund for the 4 different kind of categories of anticipatory action. For conflict, not just for anticipatory action of conflict, we're talking about response here. So those 236 have been 75% activation rate, but only 4% of those have been anticipatory. The majority of all the alerts have been, response alerts, and a huge chunk of those, 1/6, in fact, in the DRC. It's important to note that a few of those alerts are responding to conflict or violence. The majority are responding to additional needs of displacement or protection as a result of conflict. So responding to displacement is the primary way in which Start Fund supports alerts related to conflict. So conflict, displacement, migration alerts are very difficult to be specific about, which is a challenge, particularly for the examples when members are trying to anticipate them. In recent history, like of the Start Fund, mixed migration alerts have been the most common. So in Central America, these have been heavily influenced by various multi-sectoral issues, but really only recognised and raised as alerts as a result of policy changes from the US government or regional disaster causes that have led to a higher number of people taking, for example, risky journeys towards the USA. So of the included alerts over the last 5 years, like I said, fewer than 4% have been anticipatory. But the Start Fund is kind of few mechanisms which really can accept and has examples of anticipatory action for conflict. So that's to say, there's a fair amount of potential here, but Start Network members are still finding their way in terms of understanding anticipatory action around conflict and how to raise those alerts and how to turn response into anticipation, because other hazards which you can anticipate have a lot higher proportion of Start Fund alerts being anticipatory than response. So most projects, so we're not on that slide yet, we're still a few back. With most projects only responding to forced displacement once it's already happened, and conflict, despite conflicts often being endemic or occurrent in areas, most cases where conflict has been anticipated, it's been in response to a large media covered alert. So for example, the blockade in Armenia, which we're going to hear about later, the change in regime in Afghanistan in 2021, the policy change towards internally displaced persons and Syrian refugees in Syria, Lebanon and Kurdistan. These are all things which were announced well in advance. So a key theme is really in the anticipation alerts at least, having key dates that are known quite far in advance. So the cause of related anticipation alerts over the last 5 years. So this is back one slide. The majority of alerts in the last 5 years that have been anticipated under this category have been due to those policy changes. So, Title 42 policies in the USA related to asylum eligibility, the Turkish government announcing the invasion into the buffer zone in northern Syria in advance. That alert was actually for Iraq because they were anticipating displacement from northern Syria to camps on the border. The Lebanese government, announcing a recognition that permanent structures would be removed in camps well in advance, again, leading to an anticipation alert. So these are all examples where government policies and announcements have been kind of the underpinning of the anticipation alert, and NGOs have then used those as the strong justification to access funds from the START Fund in anticipation to conduct activities to mitigate and prevent. And I'll talk about the kind of activities in a moment. So next slide. Of the conflict projects over the last 5 years, 72 were deemed not forecastable. So considering that includes over 200, that's forecastable. However, agencies reported that 28 projects could have been anticipatory had certain conditions been in place. So these countries were really diverse, and it was really varying in terms of the kind of conflicts that we were talking about and whether or not they were cyclical or independent or deemed to be independent situations. Next slide, please. So STAR Network members provide a report after every alert. We do lessons learned with them. We do kind of case studies as well. And the agencies reported that they might have been able to do anticipatory action conflicts primarily had they been able to access updated data on movement, displacement, ongoing conflict or tensions. So having really dynamic risk information for anticipation alerts, or even if they've been able to kind of have a predefined or set threshold, even if it's a soft threshold around something which isn't necessarily modeled. For example, like the number of people who have been displaced in comparison to previous years, a kind of rate per year. Other members in their report stated that it had been a way to respond to unstable and sudden conflicts. Then spikes in recurrent crises could have been anticipated. Others also stated that with more available funding and stocks available for immediate short-term response, then while the displacement itself could not have been prevented, the negative impacts of displacement could have been mitigated. So I think that's a common theme we've seen with the alerts, is unlike a lot of anticipatory action that we see in the START Fund and other actors doing, which do have an angle where you're able to actually prevent those impacts and prevent the crisis occurring. The conflict ones are very much focused primarily on mitigating negative impacts. Other ways that the members reported that they could benefit from forecasting a crisis as a result of conflict are having sufficient access to kind of pre-positioned stocks and recognition of patterns in a recurrent and chronic crisis. So there we're focusing more on that aspect of spikes in ongoing situations. Great, so next slide, please. So this is a case study example from 2022, the election for Kenya. An alert was raised in advance. Election violence is a very common or the most common anticipation of conflict related crisis. And we're going to have an example from Oxfam regarding Nigeria from an anticipation alert as well. But the project here that we're talking about, the Kenya one, it was actually only activated 9 days before the election, which in terms of the examples we have is really quite short. So a lot of work was actually ongoing already to reduce negative messaging in regards to ethnic tensions. Agencies responded with behavioural change messaging, as well as reducing risk exposure to people that they consider to be most at risk by providing cash to them as an alternative to needing to work during the days that the conflict was, or the election-based violence was likely to be most severe. And it was agreed that the members who implemented the project agreed that the messages travelled well, that the victims of gender-based violence were appreciative of the risk mitigation measures to limit exposure to potential sites of conflict. So from various reasons, the elections did not generate the same level of dispute as might be expected. However, the activities were affirming and no regrets, and provided key well-being and livelihood support resources to those who might be at risk during the election period. So there's some self-reporting from the members and their reached affected populations that the activities had an impact, but it's not really attributable to say that the Anticipatory Action project was the cause of this. So next slide, please. So it's just some observations, some learnings which we've accrued from the last 5 years of anticipation of conflict alerts. So there's not enough data to be drawing trends or patterns between anticipation alerts. Displacement due to conflicts and migration are very different crises, and there are very few points of comparison between many of the alerts. Migration alerts are often responded to as a result of policy change. However, it's been flagged by Central American members, NGOs, that regional crises could be used as a point of forecast for predicted migration towards the USA. Low investment in data, inconsistency, and physical obstacles to collecting quality data are seen as an obstacle to acting ahead of these crises. Reliable data sets in areas are something that members have highlighted as a way to forecast displacement in areas listed slide. Next slide, please. So some final observations. That first one we mentioned before, there's a preference around key dates for anticipation alerts for conflict to start fund. And as part of that, there is a preference for the use of qualitative data, such as, public acts of violence, protests, contentious statements by public figures, and divisive actions. And that's often the primary bulk of an anticipation alert and the rationale for why it should be activated. But we do see it complemented by qualitative data, such as trends in number of incidents, particularly in comparison to previous years, like a growing month by month, and number of border crossings, that type of thing. The other observation, it can be quite difficult to do this analysis. Members have reported that they appreciate one of the tools members, which is our analysis for action grant. They can access some rapid funds to do some further analysis up before an upcoming situation. So, for example, we've seen members access those grants to conduct a GCAR, so a good enough context analysis rapid response, which is created by World Vision. And they've done that, for example, ahead of an election in Kenya. This was one 5 years ago. They've done one in the Philippines related to ongoing conflicts there to better understand the context and what the likely scenarios are going to be. And those have helped inform, quality start fund alerts. So, I think that's the learning we've had is particularly around these hazards where there's less understanding around how to actually predict them. funding like that rapid analysis can be really important. We've also seen members, be concerned about the publicity of anticipating conflicts. In some of the Start Fund and Start Network communications around some of our alerts, we've changed the wording or made certain documents not public so that we can reduce that for the actors who are implementing those projects to kind of not make it so public. We've seen interventions have focused primarily on mitigating and preventing secondary impacts. For example, looking at the one for Iraq for those who were displaced from northern Syria, that was very much around improving the conditions in the camps that they were expecting people to be displaced to. And then, the final one here is really, I think it speaks to something Seth was saying around, anticipatory action for conflict, not just being around, predicting conflict to for the sake of it being a primary hazard, but also how does it influence other hazards which we are looking to predict and understand and anticipate. So conflict is very much present in a lot of anticipation alerts that we see as an exacerbating, aggravating factor to make the case for the vulnerability of populations to that crisis. So food insecurity being one which is quite common. Okay, great. So that is the end of the overview of anticipatory action and conflict for the Start Fund. And what I'm going to just do a few more slides on is this exciting new piece of work which has been produced. You won't have seen it yet because it's not been published, at least publicly, but we're going to launch it in the minutes from this FOREWARN meeting. So look out for it in your inbox, as well as a longer. Sorry, I had a message saying my internet was unstable. Hopefully you can still hear me. We're going to launch this new guidance package on the use of tools and approaches to anticipatory action for conflict in the Start Fund in the FOREWARN minutes. And on the 8th of June, we'll have a long deep dive into the findings with Save the Children's context and forecasting unit who supported the creation of these products. But why did we decide to create a new product? Well, it's really because of those findings which I've already outlined, recognizing that anticipation of conflict was something which was possible in the Start Fund and somewhat of a niche for the Start Fund, but maybe wasn't being made available as widely as it could be. Funds were not being accessed as widely as they could be. And the analysis that goes into the alerts being quite focused on specific types of conflict in terms of the key dates and migration, but wanting to see whether it's possible to expand it to other locations. So we wanted to kind of understand whether or not it was feasible, coming off the back of the report that OCHA produced and Seth outlined, understanding that there were significant limitations in terms of prediction and modelling. What was feasible and what was suitable for the more dynamic approach that the Start Fund takes to anticipatory action? We and Save the Children's context analysis and forecasting unit looked at historic examples from the Start Fund. We drew on the expertise and experience from Start Fund alerts, from Start Network members and from partners, and have expanded kind of the analysis and approaches for conflicts in this piece. So we hope that we've kind of looked at what's worked and what's gone well, but also produced some ideas and theories about other approaches that Start Network members could take in terms of conflict And as part of that, we've tailored and expanded on existing databases.
Hi, Ed. I'm really sorry. I think we might have lost you.
How they could be used in those.
Unfortunately, I think we might have lost Ed due to
Specific ways that members would need to use them for the start fund. And yeah, my final slide. What is this guidance package? Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Are you able to hear me now, Millie?
Yeah, you're back. Thanks, Ed.
Okay, great. Hopefully you can hear me. This is my last slide, so maybe we'll make it to the end. So the guidance package covers three things. One is, or there's three products. One is the tools and approaches, so anticipatory action for conflict through the Start Fund. It looks at those past examples, what's worked well and what could be possible. What are the key considerations for deciding what, when and how to employ predictive or forecasting tools for conflict related to anticipatory action, focusing on the Start Fund, relevant categories and criteria to look at for when using those tools and models, those tips for Start Fund and anticipating conflict, what has and hasn't worked previously, and some great case study examples. So hopefully a really comprehensive, detailed report for members who want to deep dive and understand how they can properly integrate anticipation of conflict related approach into their day-to-day work. But then also a shorter guidance note, which is just 3 pages, which gives some kind of key rules of thumb, some quick wins and how to do it. If you're kind of not going to be, if you read in the whole report and being able to integrate it comprehensively into your work, and you've got an upcoming situation you want to anticipate, so a shorter note to kind of be able to do that in a good enough kind of way, hopefully. And then finally, that data catalog of tools and sources, so drawn from other actors, but analysed and presented in a way which hopefully should tell you how and when you can use it for anticipation of conflict for the Start Fund. So yeah, look out for that in the coming weeks when you receive your follow-up email from FOREWARN, and then look out for that invite for the 8th of June for the launch from those of us that have worked on it and produced this piece of work. I'm going to end there. Hopefully you caught enough of that to understand the work, and I'll hand it back over to Millie.
Fantastic. Thanks, Ed. Yeah, you came back online towards the end there, so I think we caught the best part of what you were saying. I'm just looking at the chat, there are a couple of questions in there. I think one that might be particularly relevant for you and for this piece of work is just around the situation where you may have instances of conflict that coincide with forecasts for other hazards, so flooding or drought or other sort of natural hazards. I wonder, was that kind of addressed in this report, and is that kind of brought up in the research, or is that not something that's covered as much?
So, sorry, that was whether or not other hazards in their relation to conflicts are covered in this report. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So not in detail, to be honest, and Seth might talk about this when he presents the anticipation of conflict working group, the Anticipation Hub, which START also participate in. There's a really excellent research being produced by the Red Cross Climate Centre alongside some of the other actors, including Seth, around this question. When we're talking about anticipatory action for conflict, we're not just talking about predicting and anticipating conflict as the primary hazard, but also what about what do we need to understand in terms of doing anticipatory action for natural hazards and other hazard types in conflict situations, particularly in protracted crises. I'd direct you towards those reports and research if you want to understand more. It's a perspective which was definitely taken into account in terms of what we produced in our research. But this report that I was presenting is really meant to be something which is operational and useful for START network members to use, specifically on raising alerts to the START fund. So it's very much meant to be an operational piece and just sit in complement, hopefully, to what other actors are doing in the larger sphere. Back to you, Millie.
Great, thanks very much, Ed. All right, I think there is some conversation ongoing in the chat, but we'll move on for now. Our next speaker, unfortunately, was not able to join us this morning due to being called away to work on Sudan, but we were hoping to hear from ACTED in relation to Start Fund Alert 672, which was raised in anticipation of the humanitarian impact of a blockade in Armenia. I will still share the slides along with the minutes later on for those who are interested. But for now, we'll be moving on to Alert 676 in Nigeria. So this was raised at the end of January of this year in anticipation of electoral tensions. I believe we have colleagues on the line from Oxfam in Nigeria who have joined us today to talk through the project, which was aiming to strengthen mechanisms for early response to electoral violence. Can I just check whether there are colleagues from Oxfam Nigeria on the line?
Yes, we are.
Lovely, brilliant, thank you. In that case, I believe you're sharing the slides from your end, so I'll hand over to you.
Hello, Daniel. Daniel is in. Daniel will share the slides.
Hello. Sorry, so we had some internet trouble. Thank you, Millie and Ed. This is Regina Asiemo for Oxfam in Nigeria. For the project that we implemented, I will be handing over to my colleagues, William, the head of programs. Daniel also is here. He was the project coordinator alongside with Chundum Cheku, so they will be presenting on our behalf. Thank you.
I think you might be on mute if you're presenting already.
Yeah, we're not presenting, we're trying to set up the presentation. This is William. Good morning, everyone from Abuja. It's nice talking about this very exciting project that was rolled out in Plateau and Kano states in Nigeria. So I'll be presenting alongside with the project coordinator, who at a point will come in to make comments on the presentation. Like we have outlined here, I would like us to pay particular attention to the challenges and how we were able to address them. And of course, the sustainability measures and recommendations that were put in place in the presentation. So we all are aware of the project goal. We try to build the resilience of our communities to respond to electoral violence through capacity building and early warning responses in place to mitigate issues around violence, as was anticipated in the Nigerian election period. And of course, the results that we were looking forward to getting, which we got, is that the communities are now resilient. Their capacities have been strengthened during the election and even after the election. And the communities now have in place networks that would ensure, communication of early warning in the future. Communities will also have their capacities built on strategies and mitigation measures against violence. And of course, these were the active players in the implementation. This is the infographic of what we did. Oxfam as the lead implementer, together with our partners in Plateau and in Kano. And the 4 local governments pinpointed there on the maps of Kano and Plateau State. And the data available there, about 2,760 individuals reached directly, and about 19,000 and more indirectly reached in the 4 local governments of the 2 states. And of course, the project lifespan lasted 60 days from February 4th to April 4th. So at this point, I will call on Daniel, who was the chief implementer, to take it up from here and give us more on the planned activities and results. Thank you.
All right, thanks a lot, William, and nice to have colleagues all over. For us, in order to achieve the goal of this project, we were very, very strategic in bringing out key approaches that will support in the implementation, which is in the way we brought out the uniqueness of the activities that we had implemented. Can we have the next slide, please? So basically, we started with advocacy engagements across our target LGAs, which we got the support and buy-in of critical stakeholders that we've been able to work with. We had a target of 410, though we met 173, even though we'll discuss about that when we get to the slide for challenges and also the mitigations that we employed. And also, we also engage, we're very strategic in engaging youths, looking at the composition of youths and how there are situations and reports of them being the major drivers of conflicts, especially within the political spaces. So we engage with these youths across these states. That's 900, the target was 900 youths, but we engaged 1,291, and we were able to bring out clear youth-driven roadmap that will support and guide youth engagements around peace within the period of the election. And we were also deliberate in engaging the general public through media. So we came up with innovations like unity songs in different languages, peace messages in different languages, more than 7 local languages for acceptance and also for wider reach. Earlier, we had planned for 4,500 audience to be reached, but of course, looking at the media composition and the strategic media stations we ended up using across for the project, we had a total reach of 180,501. And of course, We also were introduced a unique approach of reaching out to even the population that do not have access to these kind of the technologies in terms of radio, television, and also phones. So we were very granular in our approach of taking this intervention to Market Square, where we have a large number of people coming to engage in one business activity or the other. And of course, the concert was an avenue to draw people together, and peace messages were presented in various forms. There were role plays, there were strategic stakeholders coming in to discuss, and also even peace ambassadors coming in to talk to these people. And this activity got a wide acceptance across. And also we're very strategic in also meeting with critical stakeholders to formulate strategies that will guide engagements within the election, which we were able to also get a total of 550. We also employed the use of technology, where we got mobile phones and we distributed them across target communities to what we call monitors for quick triangulation of information around the conflicts that may arise within communities. And these were utilized as seen in the kind of reports that we got and how we were able to mitigate. Then also, we assess and we had an on-spot assessment of the elections, looking at triggers that may lead to violence within the period of the election, and we were able to reach a total of 280 as against 260. So basically, we also saw the need of enhancing capacity of critical stakeholders, which is critical for us, as it kept emanating from these communities. And for us, it will be a strong strategy. It was a strong strategy for sustainability. We also had series of engagement, like also having to review some of the elections and most of the critical issues that came on board. And of course, we even had more than anticipated, because people were willing and ready to share their experiences. This all culminated into us having a learning and experience session where all the partners converge, and we discuss on some of the outcomes as well as some of the challenges we had encountered. So Anna, please, over to you.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Talking about the complaints and the feedback.
Okay.
Mechanisms that we have, we put in place during the implementation of the project. We're able to place suggestion boxes in communities to enable people to report cases anonymously, and we're able to get cases reported from these communities on GBV, especially these cases we were able to refer through our referral pathways to be tackled by other organizations who were well equipped to tackle some of these issues. The communities also were able to handle some of the cases reported through these channels. We were deliberate to train our partners and also our community members on safeguarding issues. In the community, we were able to have four focal persons on safeguarding in the 2 local governments, both in Kano and Plateau State. We were able to have 40 monitors on the ground to ensure that the whole electoral process was safe for the people. We had 145 community leaders who were also in the field to ensure that the communities were properly taken care of. We also had feedbacks that we got from those communities, and those feedbacks showed that the project was very apt and important, because the feedbacks gotten showed that the activities undertaken dies down the tensions that were already looming in the air. And also this, for instance, in Taroni local government, where we had a conflict, but because of the mechanisms put in place already by the project, it was able to be reverted. We also had young people giving testimony of them shunning electoral violence, and people living with disability also happy about the inclusivity of the project. Daniel, you can go ahead with the learnings.
All right. Thanks a lot, Anna. So for us, critically, in terms of learning, I will also lean on what Anna just finished talking about, which is in terms of inclusion of persons with disabilities. Looking at feedback from this category, they were so excited that they were included as per such kind of intervention. Usually do not capture them. And for us, it was really exciting to have this kind of feedback. I will encourage further programming and other partners to be able to leverage on this key learning. And important that we use for this project, which has to do with engagement of key community members throughout the project, which gave them that strong ownership of the project. And for us, this is very key as we continue, or other partners continue to engage on similar projects. As we have been able to learn a lot, there are also some challenges that we were also confronted with, which basically, can we go to the next slide, please? Which basically borders around access to few stakeholders within that period, because it was the peak of the electioneering period and there were restrictions of movements. Then we were able to innovatively leverage on our existing relationship with some of these partners, especially even that relationship between the partner organizations and the community. And of course, we highlighted earlier during the activities presentation on our reach. But of course, it was challenging for us to get the media reach to disaggregate persons with disability. But of course, as a way to mitigate and have tangible figures, we leverage on the use of online media analytics, which guided our submission. Then, of course, looking at all these also, we had sustainability measures that were also deliberate. We deliberately fused these measures into this programming. And of course, we talked about the ownership where it's community driven. So already these platforms are embedded in these communities, and they will be able to continue with such engagement in terms of mitigating or reporting early warning signs within their communities. And of course, we also placed in certain support, certain support in terms of the safe guardian and complaint boxes across these communities, which for us is critical in terms of how they will continue to receive information around. Also, the localization of these activity into engaging with critical stakeholders for them to understand the idea, which they brought in clear roadmap, which was suitable and fitting to this intervention, was something that stood out strongly, especially when we had strong words from the Director General of National Orientation Agency, asserting on the progress which leverage on some of these opportunities. So for them, they will be able to continue with that momentum and address issues within their communities as they continue to arise. Then basically, we will also, for every project, getting the required knowledges as well as sustainability measures. It is also ideal to also have recommendations which will also speak out in terms of other ways to better strengthen community efforts as it gets to early warning. Please, can we go to the next slide? So as a way of critical recommendation, we will recommend that there's need for continuous engagement of these platforms. As we kept reiterating, these are community-driven platforms. And looking at the period for this engagement, there's more. We achieved a lot, but there's still more that we need to do around strengthening these structures so that they will continue to do this work that they've been able to do and achieve the successes, even more leverage on the successes that we've been able to achieve. And again, there's also a need to invest more in early warning engagements, targeting critical communities through technical support, as well as other material support that will guide their engagement and how they triangulate around early warning signs as well as signal. But overall, it's really been an exciting opportunity to work around these communities and to see how these communities have taken charge of their security, which for us is very critical in terms of how to mitigate conflicts around communities and the world at large. Thank you very much, and over.
Thank you very much to the whole team for such a deep insight into the kind of project that can be done, ahead of these kind of key dates that we were talking about a little bit before, like elections. And I think thanks also for really identifying those key suggestions and recommendations for ensuring the sustainability of the project. I think it's great to have such concrete suggestions for how to move forward once the project is complete. So thank you to the team in Nigeria. We're zooming back out again for the next agenda item, which will focus again a bit more around some of the theory. So we're actually handing back to Seth again. So sorry, Seth, to be calling on you again. But I think you're going to give a bit of an update on the work that's been done to date and some of the future plans for the Anticipation Hub's working group for anticipating conflict. So Seth, back to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Millie. And yeah, I'm filling in Tessie DeBoer of sort of Climate Centre, who coordinates or is one of the co-coordinators of this working group, is going to present, but I think she's out today actually. So I'm just stepping in for her and representing the wide network that participates in this practitioners group. And yeah, if you go to the next slide, I'll just really quickly share with you an update on kind of the areas that we're trying to focus on as part of our work. So when Catalina and Marie Wagner, they wrote a paper a few years ago, which really laid out a lot of questions that drove the research I did, and I imagine some of the work a lot of you do, and set out exactly what we mean when we talk about anticipatory action in conflict-affected contexts, and split this into two types, which is anticipatory action for phenomena that aren't directly conflict related, but maybe exacerbated by conflict. And the type two, the one that I was looking into, in which we've also kind of heard discussed a bit here today, which is anticipatory action for conflict itself. And we split our work stream into these two buckets. And on type one, this anticipatory action for maybe floods, or which is really what we're talking about here, floods or drought, any kind of meteorological hazards. The key questions we're trying to look at is, can we even do anticipatory action in conflict-affected settings? Some of the comments in the Zoom chat now, we're talking about the difficulties in, predicting, humanitarian impact when you have issues like conflict arising around a drought. You know, I would argue my personal stance is I think it is definitely possible. You can look at somewhere like Somalia this year and over the past 4 years of this exacerbated drought, and yeah, I think you can still do stuff there. But it's an important question to dig into and see the limits of anticipatory action when we're working in complex crises where conflict is driving need alongside various other factors. If once we've looked into this, yeah, how do we adjust our approaches? What do we need to do to make this work better in these types of cases? And really for, you know, all of this work on this side, it's understanding who's doing what in these spaces. It's not like we're coming into an empty vacuum, but there's a lot of ongoing work from UN agencies, from international NGOs, from local partners, from even governments themselves, and we can understand who's doing what where and how we can learn from these examples. And I would say, you know, while this sits in this type 1 bucket, I do think it's similar that we can do the same in this kind of type 2 anticipatory action for conflict. We should always be trying to learn from the work that all of our fantastic colleagues around the world are doing. But more specifically on this sort of type 2 side, we're looking at, what is the, you know, sort of mandate? Like, what are the ethical considerations? What are our roles in doing anticipatory action for conflict impacts? There's a lot of questions around, you know, previously all of our work is completely public and available. That would be a lot more difficult if we were working on conflict prediction, because suddenly you would have, in our case, a UN agency saying there's going to be conflict here, presumably either explicitly or implicitly. You understand what actors they mean. There's a lot of issues that need to be fleshed out there. It's not my expertise, but it's important to know that we, you know, hopefully have some people in this realm working on these problems. You know, is there data on the more technical side that we work on? Is the data available to receive early warnings for conflict? And how can we better understand the impacts? So what can we do there? And so if you go to the next slide, these are just some of the key questions that we are working on. And what have we done in answering these questions? So some of the working group members have developed a best practices sheet for these kind of traditional anticipatory action in complex contexts to start providing guidance on how we can basically do this work in these areas. We've started doing this really 3-4W work of mapping who's doing what where, and there's some guidance that's been produced on anticipatory action in displacement contexts, particularly in camps and around urban contexts. So we're starting to develop some of these guidance to build off of the lessons learned so far in doing hydrogeological anticipatory action in conflict zones. And on the second type, for anticipatory action for conflict, we've started mapping the tools and the models and the things that we have available to us to start looking into this work. We're having lots of discussion, I mean, even today's a good example, on the opportunities and limitations of anticipatory action. And I think these are going to just continue to happen. So we better come to an agreement and develop a sort of robust learning space on how we can predict and do anticipatory action on these humanitarian impacts of conflict. And building off of this, who's doing what where, we're hoping to do technical research on the technical feasibility of conflict prediction, but not just on sort of global models from an academic setting, but trying to look at approaches that have been done for maybe not AA, maybe for DRR or preparedness, but seeing how those perform and how well they might be applied in an AA context. And that's the work of this wide working group from a lot of fantastic members. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Seth. I think that's really useful framing for some of the conversation that's happening in the chat and then some of the presentations that we've had already this morning. It's important to remember, I think, that none of this is happening in a vacuum, and there's some really challenging and interesting questions in there as well. Please do feel free to share any of the resources. I can see people are sharing things as we go, but if there are any resources from the working group that you'd like to share with the people on the call today, please do feel free to share those in the chat. But for now, I'm handing over to our next speaker. So a member of the working group, I believe, as the Danish Refugee Council, have been working to develop a predictive model for displacement with the support of ECHO, amongst others. So I'm handing over now to Alex Kierum, a senior analyst and global advisor for DRC, who's going to run through the model and how it might be used for anticipatory action. Alexander, over to you. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me to also present on this work today. Yeah, if we go to the next slide. So we've been working for essentially the past 5 years on sort of trying to develop models to predict force displacement, initially in a partnership with IBM, but currently sort of working on it on ourselves with funding from ECHO, CEDA, and the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And we're really sort of working with an objective to develop these sort of prediction tools to both enhance our understanding of displacement, but also provide us and the wider humanitarian sector with the sort of accurate forecasts and scenarios that can be used for strategic planning and also operational response, and as such also an anticipatory action. So all the models we develop are sort of available open source, and typically we also try to develop some user interfaces to make it easily accessible to other actors. Yeah, and yeah, basically if you go to the next slide. So we've actually developed 3 models, but I'll zoom in on 2 today, which looks at predicting conflict-induced displacement. The last model I'll not speak so much on today is around drought-induced displacement that we have been working on in Somalia, and actually the only model so far that we have used for anticipatory action. But the initial model we developed was called the foresight model, which is more attuned to sort of support overall annual strategic planning. So that model can be used to predict the number of displaced people from a given country 1 to 3 years into the future. And that model currently covers 26 countries around the world, so the major sort of the current displacement crises. And when we developed that, some of the feedback we got from our staff on the ground were so great, very interesting, but it's not very operational. It would be much better for us if you could help us predict exactly sort of where and when people are going to be displaced. So then we developed a second model, a sort of a spin-off model that we call the Wakafi model, to sort of support that more sort of operational response. So that now model is essentially predicting the number of displaced people that will be in a given admin 1 location 3 to 4 months into the future. And that model covers currently, we have it applied in Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, and are expanding it to South Sudan in the coming months, and also looking into to expand to other countries, for example, Somalia and DR Congo are some of the countries we've been looking at. We're also now working on it at the admin 2 level, in addition to the admin 1 level, because when we had developed this model, the feedback we got from our staff was, this is great, can you do it at the admin 2 level, which would be even more useful. So now we're doing that. If we go to the next slide. So both of these models are sort of machine learning models. In our foresight model, we use more than 120 different indicators, all drawn from open sources. Most, I mean, of course, a lot related to conflict, but we also have indicators related to governance, economy, socio-demographics, and so on. For the Wakafi model, we try to, of course, as a starting point, use the same indicators, but of course, when you move to the subnational level, you have much fewer indicators. So at the admin 1 level, we have around 25 different indicators, most of them related to conflicts, but also something around vegetation, health index. You have food insecurity numbers as well, and a few other aspects as well. At the admin 2 level, we are then down to 20 different indicators at that level. Yeah. If we go to the next slide. So the outputs we are producing with both models are essentially sort of point estimates around how many, what will the total number of displaced people be. Either with the foresight model, it's at the national level, 1 to 3 years into the future. At the WCAFI model, then it's 3 to 4 months into the future. For the WCAFI model, we use it slightly differently. We make sort of the forecast also more sort of scenario based, where we sort of make one forecast essentially based on that the current situation will continue as is into the future, and then a second scenario based on inputs from our staff and area managers on the ground, and then we have sort of an essentially and also get an interval in terms of where we expect the changes will happen. You can see that for the foresight model, the average margin of error, if we look at all the, I think we have around 260 historical forecasts made so far. If we essentially compare those to how many were actually displaced, what were the actual results or numbers, the average margin of error is 90%. In some of the best performing countries, it's the model is down to, has an average margin of error down to 6-7%. And actually more than half of the forecasts we've made with foresight had an error margin that was below 10% of the actual displacement levels. If we look at then the results from the accuracy of the WCAFI model, we can see that actually it's slightly more accurate than the results we're getting in the foresight model. So at the admin 1 level, we have an average margin of error down to 11%, and at the admin 2 level, 17%. So I think our sort of conclusion based on these sort of exercises that we can actually get something fairly accurate with these models. So it is a sort of a good starting point and a useful tool. With the foresight model, we can also compare a little bit to other approaches to sort of strategic planning and in the humanitarian sector, where our model looks to be more accurate. But I would say I sort of also echo. I echo a lot what Seth also presented earlier in terms of the ability to predict conflict. That these models are not useful for predicting all of a sudden a displacement crisis in a country where there isn't currently a displacement crisis. And I would say the other major limitation, of course, with these models is sort of a sudden unprecedented surge in displacement is also sort of outside of what is feasible with these models. So they tend to be a bit, have a sort of a conservative bias. And take the example of Ukraine, our foresight model didn't predict any sort of significant increase in displacement there. Our foresight prediction for Sudan this year also only suggests a limited increase in displacement. So what these models are useful for is the sort of ups and downs in displacement when certain situations are escalating, but not escalating to a point where it's completely sort of unprecedented, I would say. And yeah, if we go to the next slides, then we are now we have, as I mentioned, we've done a pilot on, we are not so very strong on anticipatory action in Danish refugee camp. We don't have a lot of experience doing this type of work. We've done one pilot currently that's ongoing, where we just triggered in February, which was in relation to sort of drought-induced displacement in Somalia. But we have recently received funding from ECHO to pilot the use of this sort of WCAFI model, so conflict-induced displacement, for anticipatory action in Burkina Faso and South Sudan. And I think we already also saw some good examples of what are some of the potential activities you can do. And I think also Ed mentioned sort of that maybe some of the, whereas with drought and other sort of natural hazards, you tend to focus more on how can you actually prevent the humanitarian impact or shock from affecting people. That is a bit more tricky when we look at conflict-induced displacement. But we're essentially envisioning that there will be sort of 3 different areas where we can essentially intervene. So one will be in the in the place of origin of displacement. And that's you could say the most tricky part. I think we recognize, of course. Some of the activities we envision potentially could be done here is, for example, peace building and dialogue type workshops, if the type of conflicts that driving displacements is, for example, around ethnic tensions and so on. That type of activity is probably not relevant in a case like Burkina Faso, where much of the displacement is driven by extremist groups. So it would be, I at least personally have a hard time envisioning how you would do sit down and do peace building workshop with those type of actors. But some of the other things you can also do is engagement with the armed groups along sort of a protection dialogue to try to negotiate safe access to civilians and so on. Also just sharing the information. I think that goes for most AA, and you know that better than me, that just sharing the information with communities that you are concerned that a potential shock is going to happen in the near future. The households can do a lot themselves in terms of preparing and protecting themselves. Other aspects can be around also just doing initial sort of identification of vulnerable households and what are the needs of these people that we forecast or estimate or predict will have to leave these areas soon, so you can be better prepared in the place of destination. The other thing we are looking at is then what can you do in terms of protection on the move, so that you are prepared for when people are moving from the place of origin to a place of destination, that you already have some sort of support along those routes, essentially where people are moving. And then I think the most sort of easy, clear-cut aspect in terms of doing this is then looking at how can you work in the use these type of models, predictions to be better prepared essentially in the place of destination. We already talked about sort of pre-positioning of supplies. There can also be engagement with host communities, preparing the host communities that potentially would be an influx of displaced people from certain areas with certain type of needs and so on. So those are some of the activities that we sort of very broadly envision. But the way we would like to design these approaches will be in very sort of close coordination with the communities that we focus on and are piloting this. So a lot of this will also be defined by the communities themselves in terms of the needs that they see and what is relevant and what type of support can you use before the potential displacement from conflict. If we go to the next slide, and I think that's the last one. Yes, yeah, I think maybe we'll just skip this one. I actually forgot I included that one. Or is that the last one? Yeah, okay. But anyway, I think the last point I wanted to make is that what we want to do is also sort of echoing a bit what Seth said in terms of what are some of the opportunities then, is that given the limitations of these models, but also opportunities, we don't foresee establishing sort of an AA mechanism where we rely solely on these models, but where we work, for example, with local communities and also get some of their qualitative information into whether action should be triggered. So you could say our models can raise some red flags, and those can then be validated through engagement with the communities on the ground. We are also now working on improving the models with protection monitoring data that we're already gathering in these locations, because we think that we can see already that there can be good signals in the protection monitoring data in terms of anticipating conflict, and of course then also the ensuing displacement. So for example, one of the things that we've just done a small analysis on the protection data in Burkina Faso, and can see, there's sort of seems to be a good prediction in when people are withdrawing, or when households are withdrawing their kids from school. Then a couple of months later, we see increases in displacement. So that's typically maybe one of the first signs and coping mechanisms of households, that now there is a level on safety that means now the first thing I do is withdraw my kids from school and then see hopefully the situation goes over. But then typically the situation then potentially escalates, and then you end up leaving. So it's also sort of identifying those type of signals in the data and how we can use that. So yeah, so we work the way we envision using these models is by working and validating everything in close coordination with the communities on the ground. And that's also why we're very hopeful that we can share these tools with this excellent network, because of course, when you want to work very locally, there's also a limit to then how many areas you can cover as one organization. So we're really hoping to work with a lot of the organizations in this network on how these models could inform anticipatory action. So I think I will stop there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Alexander. It's really great to see an example of, the kind of model that can be developed and how it can be used to flag up these potential events. And I think also seeing some of those examples of actions is really interesting as well. You mentioned it's open source, so I think feel free to share links or resources in the chat, but we'll also be sharing those along with the minutes after the call, and can potentially set up any conversations ongoing after this as well. You mentioned you might be expanding to DR Congo, and I know there's several people on the call who are based there, so I'm sure they will be following your work with great interest. So yeah, thank you very much for that presentation. For our next speaker, our final speaker of the day, we're heading back to Nigeria. So Derek Groen is a lecturer in simulation and modelling at Brunel University, and also a long-standing member of Global FOREWARN. Derek's been working in collaboration with Save the Children in Nigeria on a predictive displacement model for forced displacement. And we'll also talk a little bit, I think, about the flea migration modelling code in general. So Derek, handing over to you. Thank you very much.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. Next slide, I guess. Let's see. Should I share my screen, or I think slides are on your side, right?
Oh, I think you sent them through in PDF. So if you can share them, that would be great. Otherwise, we can quickly get them.
No, I've got actually a better version here. So if we could share my screen.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Thanks.
Let's see. Okay, just give me a second. Building display. That's actually even better. Okay. Can you see my? Well, already gave it all talk. Can you see my first slide?
Yes, you're good to go.
Okay, very good. So yeah, good morning, everybody. So yeah, my name is Derek Groen. Yeah, actually I'm a reader these days in simulation modeling. A couple of name changes, position changes in the meantime. Yeah, so I will talk about the predictive displacement model, FLEA actually, with a clear example for Nigeria, but we'll talk about it more generally because quite a lot has happened since I last presented for the START network. The work I do is by no means something I do alone. I think Diana Suleimanova has done a lot of work on fleas in the call, and we also have Ali Reza, Yahani, and Yani Shui within the team. And also there are 3 research projects that are quite closely related to the work and that have been funding the work that we've been doing. 2 about verification of simulations, and 1 specific migration modeling project called IT Flows, which was funded by the EU. So yeah, just as a recap, we think that predicting forced displacement can help, of course, to allocate resources or to plan interventions for NGOs. So I think that is, yeah, one of the main use cases that has been recognized in recent years. We also think there are 2 other possible use cases for predicting forced displacements. They can help to complete incomplete data collections, particularly if these predictions don't rely on training data or historical data. And we think there could also be an advocacy aspect to it, because by predicting forced displacement, you could also look at counterfactuals and basically see, okay, what could have been the consequences of a nation closing their border, opening a new camp, or moving a camp, or other types of interventions. Now, the code that we work on within IT Flows and at Brunel is called FLEA, and FLEA is very different to most of the the population displacement forecasting codes, because it's not a machine learning code, it's an agent-based modeling code. Now, what does that mean? It basically means that every person in the simulation is an actual object in the code, and we actually have explicit assumptions about how people would be behaving, explicit assumptions about how conflict could be evolving, and also explicit assumptions about how towns, conflict regions, and camps are connected with each other. And what we use for that, basically for that last bit, is, well, we identify locations, major locations within a country. We then try to figure out, okay, will conflicts happen there or not? And then we also add towns, and we basically use route planners to figure out, okay, how are all these locations connected with each other? And then, of course, we will also add other locations like camps abroad, or perhaps even IDP camps within the country. And in that way, we create a graph, a kind of a map of our simulation. How the individuals behave, we have a range of assumptions from the past, but we also got a lot of new understanding about how they behave from various interviews, reports, and collaborations with NGOs like Save the Children and organizations like UNHCR and the Institute of Migration. Now, what FLEE does is it doesn't forecast conflict itself. We tend to take conflicts either based on scenario descriptions, and then we stochastically randomly generate a conflict that matches that description, or multiple conflicts, or we use one of the existing conflict prediction tools that are out there. But what FLEE forecasts is basically, given a kind of conflict development over time, it forecasts where people will basically go when they are being displaced by conflicts. A very important development that we have done within the IT Flows project is the 3.0 version of FLEE. And quite notably, it now supports different attributes for people in, or agents in the simulation. So we can have people of different age, ethnicity, and gender. And we can also have behavioral rules where we say, okay, children will behave in a different way than adults, or perhaps, for example, men of a certain age are less likely to be displaced by conflict than men and women of different ages. And all this information, we don't need personal data for it, but we can sample the distribution of ages, ethnicity, and genders from demographic information. And if you want to know more, there's the link on the bottom left, basically. Now, why is FLEE useful for modeling conflict-driven displacement? Well, FLEE is actually a relatively old code within the scene. Our first version dates back to 2016. And we have been able to validate it across at least 8 recent historical conflicts. And actually, the true number, I think, is more like 10. And across these conflicts, we are able to get 75% accuracy or more. What is also really nice about FLEE is, because we don't train based on historical data, it's very easy for us to introduce very fine-grained interventions or alternative scenarios. For example, different types of conflict development, or different interventions from NGOs or governments. And for instance, conflicts can be supplied to the code using a very simple human-readable format that you can create in any way that you like. And the third advantage is, because FLEE is an agent-based model, the lack of data or limitation data collections do not as strongly affect our forecasts as they do for other codes and other techniques. And many of the assumptions that we have from previous conflicts, either in the same country or in different regions, can be reused in new conflict settings as a starting point. The model also doesn't need personal data, and there's no training phase or need for any historical data to perform any forecast. Other advantages, and this is something that I became more aware of in the basically in the last year, because we had a huge discussion with a large number of NGOs about the EU Artificial Intelligence Act, where a lot of AI predictive tools are considered to be risky. But one advantage of FLEE is that FLEE isn't actually a self-learning tool, so it doesn't qualify as an AI tool and is not affected by these AI regulations. That being said, of course, you still do have to make responsible use of public data sources, and you don't want to make the simulation biased, but it's not a self-learning system. So the AI Act doesn't actually affect FLEE directly. Another advantage is we have location graphs from many countries readily available, and that allows us to construct simulations in a matter of days rather than weeks or months, what we had in the past. Lastly, FLEE is open source, it's open development, and it's free. So there's a GitHub page where you can see all the developments, all the issues, and all the releases that we've made. So everyone can basically scrutinize what we do in terms of development and whether we do it right or whether certain things need to be changed. One example use case, of course, as Millie already mentioned, is the modeling of internal displacement in Nigeria. So with FLEE, we have a pretty good track record of modeling displacement abroad to adjacent countries, but we're now also starting to look at internal displacement and driving factors and modeling and visualizing that. And we've got an active collaboration with Save the Children UK, with William Lowe and Auke Tas, where they actually construct a simulation of Nigeria with all the locations and all the rules. And we provide basically the necessary features to allow them to make the simulation. On the link at the bottom, that basically leads to a GitHub page from Save the Children, where they have a visualization from Nigeria, as you can see on the image, that shows in a forecasting model how people are being displaced from different locations. And what you can also do in this version of the code is that on every link, you can see how many people have traversed the link, and you can see a disaggregation by gender, by age, or if you want also by ethnicity, if you were to include that in the code. The validation performance of this model has been rather good, actually, but at the same time, it is also an ongoing work, and we're basically trialing and testing it with Save the Children to see, okay, how could we apply these kind of techniques effectively in the humanitarian context. Now, in terms of speed of construction, and I think this is something I wanted to mention specifically for the START initiative. In the past, we've had some difficulties rapidly constructing simulations, and say 3 years ago, it often took us 4, 6, or 8 weeks to construct a viable simulation of conflict-driven displacement. That problem we've managed to solve largely in different ways. We've managed to automate many steps. So even if we start from scratch, we can often create a simulation now in about 2 weeks rather than say 2 months. But also we have already created location graphs, those maps for a lot of different countries. So when we have modeled the conflict previously, we can actually reuse those maps, update them with new camps or new conflict locations, and construct a simulation in a matter of a few days. So yeah, and another benefit is that actually in terms of human resources, several of the people who used to be PhD students and postdocs within my group actually have academic positions. So we also have sort of the human effort available to make a forecast in 2 or 3 days if that is needed. So for instance, with the conflict going on in Sudan, or perhaps if there's interest in modeling DRC, then those are things that we can do on a rather short notice. And in general, we have a lot of anticipatory simulation setups for countries so that we can make forecasts more quickly, but also we have vetted them in advance, so then the forecasts are also more reflective of reality and therefore more accurate. So what is the status of FLEE today? Well, basically we validated FLEE across at least 8 historical conflicts, and in fact we have a simple code that does the validation test when we change the code, how that is being affected, and it has a good track record there. We also are now able to make forecasts quite rapidly with limited cost and limited effort, and also the code is very flexible to allow quick customization, like the introduction of new rules, adding new camps, or changing the conflict development, so you can easily adapt it for new simulations. FLEE 3.0 is in the beta stage, it's generally working, but we're basically ironing things out, figuring out, okay, what kind of assumptions should we change to make the code even more flexible and accurate. And yeah, the official full release is this summer, but we're already using this version. And yeah, basically a FLEE can be of use for specific countries or specific NGOs within the START network. Then we're happy to work together in anticipation of that, and also to make fast forecasts for different countries. Thank you very much. That's everything I have, actually, perhaps rather short.
Lovely. Thanks so much, Derek. Yeah, that was fantastic. It's really great to see the kind of model that you guys are working on, and how that might be applicable for the START network members in various contexts. So thank you for that. We do still have 15 minutes. So I'd like to just open now for any questions from the floor. So if you'd like to raise your hand if you have a question, otherwise feel free to post that in the chat and I can pick those up as we go. But are there any questions to kick us off? I'm conscious people might need a moment to kind of gather thoughts after so much information. But Anna Dizon, I know you were asking some questions earlier around some of the different pieces of research around kind of larger scale predictions and forecasts for conflict. I don't know if you'd like to come off mute and pose that question.
Hi, Millie. Thank you. Well, I think in some parts, Seth has addressed some of the questions, but I think there are actually two parts. One is the predictive part, wherein about the issue of forecasting, and of course I do understand that right now, and perhaps because of the nature of the hazard conflict in itself, the predictive part is really very difficult, and because there are also many moving parts as well. But I was just thinking the range of presentations. One is understanding whether conflict as a hazard in itself can be predicted based on its root cause, for example, and then the different presentations by Alexander and by Derek about predicting displacements. But these are displacements, meaning there are certain factors that these are already existing displacements, for example, camps or any kind of movements. I am just wondering whether they can be, I don't know, sort of designed in such a way that there are like two steps procedure looking at the source of conflict that can feed into the model for human displacements. I'm sorry, maybe it's not so coherent at the moment, but I am trying to sort of imagine how the two process sort of can work hand in hand, understanding the root cause, as in the chaos itself that results to displacement. I saw Derek's raised hand. Yeah, thank you. Back to you.
Thanks, Anna. Yeah, Derek, over to you.
All right. Yeah, of course, I can only talk for the fleet perspective, but what you're describing is actually what we have done in an earlier trial with Save the Children for Tigray in Ethiopia. So one important thing to emphasize is that we don't need to run one simulation. A fleet model is very cheap to run. It takes an hour or a few hours to run, and we have access to supercomputers. So we can easily generate 100 or 1,000 different conflict progressions and run the simulation against each possible conflict, and then see, okay, how is migration affected by different ways that the conflict develops. So the setup you describe is one we already do. So FLEE is very much optimized for new conflicts and not for sort of modeling existing long-term migration for many reasons. Now, how do you forecast the conflict? Well, of course, you can use a conflict prediction model, but another way to do it is to simply ask people in the humanitarian sector, say, okay, what kind of conflict would you expect to happen? And then very often you can get a textual description. So for example, in Tigray, there was a description like, okay, we suspect that there will be some major conflict in the north and that could spread out to the south. But we would also like to see an alternative scenario where it could be quite close to the western border. And based on these descriptions, you can make conflict scenarios without having the precise prediction. And then you can see, okay, what do these different scenarios, how do they affect the migration and the arrivals in the different camps and locations? So yeah, that setup is basically the setup that we're working with today.
Thanks, Derek. Thank you very much. And I think that actually speaks a little bit to a comment in the chat from Diogo from ACAPS, who's actually just stepped off the call, but has mentioned that ACAPS are also, rather than predicting what's most likely to happen, looks at the different possibilities and the consequences of those different scenarios, which seems to be a logical route to take following some of the work that Seth was talking about earlier in this call. Are there any other questions from the floor for our speakers? If not, I think we can possibly come to an early close. I'm just keen to make sure that everybody has had a chance, particularly those who are listening through interpretation. Conscious there is a slight lag. Okay, seems like there aren't any questions. So in that case, I will draw the meeting to a close. Oh, hang on, there is a question in the chat. So Isidore from Medefa Hops in DRC asks, what might a model look like for DRC in the situation where there has been kind of ongoing conflict situations for over 20 years? So I think that talks a little bit to the kind of ongoing conflict situations that we spoke about earlier, and what predictive models might look like in that context. Is maybe, oh, Derek, go ahead, please. Yeah. Oh, you're just on mute.
Sorry, I'm probably not the only one. We should answer that one, but yeah, I think from my perspective, so my French is really broken, so I have to do it in English. Essentially, you can take the historical data and that's fine, but we would basically just create a map of the DRC and then think about, okay, again, what kind of conflict scenarios do we expect or could we expect? And then also, if we get displacement, where do we expect these people to go, and where do we foresee that the camps would be in the adjacent countries? So we would make a setup like that, which probably takes a few days to put together. And then essentially based on the conflict scenario, we would make an estimation of how many people would be displaced in different conflict locations. And then Fleet would forecast, okay, this is the routes that they take, this is where they go, and this is where we would expect them to arrive. And then different conflict scenarios may also lead to different numbers of people being displaced. But yeah, that's how we would do it. And I think to do it completely, yeah, I guess this would be more at the 2 weeks end of things rather than the 2 days, because we don't have a location graph for DRC yet. But yeah, so that would be my answer.
Thanks very much. And don't worry about the French, we have live interpretation, so it's all good. Seth, please, over to you.
First off, amazing on the live interpretation. That's the first time I've seen it. Really fantastic. So without getting into the details of exactly what a model would look like on like on the conflict side itself, you know, it's certainly would be the way that the sort of conflict models are currently working in this sort of state of the art. These large, typically sort of machine learning models will ingest a litany of data, particularly on historical conflict patterns, you know, to try and understand historical dynamics and in some way better predict into the future. And of course, as I think I've mentioned in the chat, there will be lots of other exogenous variables that they will try to include in these models to improve the predictive performance at kind of a subnational level. So for instance, Views, probably the most famous conflict prediction team, produced kind of predictions at a grid cell level about 50 kilometers wide each, as well as at the national level. And, you know, these include lots and lots of subnational data. Just to note, one of the problems of these models, this subnational data is often static. You know, it's not updated frequently. They're derived themselves from global models. So it might be information on poverty rates that was estimated 4 years ago in a, you know, DHS or MIT survey, and it's not really reactive to shifting ongoing realities. And so, you know, one of the benefits if people are exploring their own modeling techniques, particularly if they're, you know, working on the ground, where is access to much more frequently updated and granular information, including, you know, data you can get from experts on the ground. But I mean, it's a really complex question. What would a model look like? But I just think those are some of the aspects you probably want to consider at a base level before you dig into all the granular details. And since I'm here and chatting, I just wanted to add just one last thought, just based on all these conversations, what Diogo put in the chat and what I've been talking about, the interesting presentation from Derek. I think from my perspective, I think it's all super interesting and amazing to see the different ways you can apply modeling techniques and data for, you know, forward-looking approaches to decision making. and I think we have been here, but like explicit what is, you can call it an anticipatory approach, but what anticipatory actions versus what is using some strategic decision making. For displacement or conflict, we really like to consider anticipatory action as set thresholds, decisions that are based on some type of automated process to encourage, the sort of extremely fast response that we've been using in our anticipatory action pilots. And so it's not about improving decision making with data or doing strategic risk analysis or scenario modeling. I think those are incredible tools, but when we're talking about anticipatory action, I really think it's good to make sure we're clear on what anticipation is within the box, a sort of foresight approach might be and what a disaster risk reduction approach might be, so we can be really clear when we say what is possible, what's not, and how we want to move forward. So I think super interesting discussions today. Excited to see all this work for everyone, and thanks for having me.
Thanks very much, Seth. Just in the last couple of minutes, I wonder if Alexander, if you're still on the line, if you wanted to speak a little bit to the plans for Danish Refugee Council potentially expanding to DR Congo. I'm not sure if that's something go over to you.
Yeah, sure. No, so I mean, DR Congo is of course an interesting case because you have, as was also mentioned, you have many years of conflict and displacement continuously happening in sort of ebbs and flows and different cycles. And so we have done some preparatory work. We engaged with Mercy Corps and the Humanitarian Analysis team, I believe it's called, in DRC at one point, because they're doing some excellent work on the qualitative side of things in terms of looking at potential displacement going forward. So we had some initial conversations with them around how could we potentially combine their qualitative work with our modeling to come up with something. Due to sort of funding and resources and time constraints, we haven't been able to move forward on that so far. But the other thing we're also, just to try to make things even more complex now, is to look at also sort of the cross-border movement from DR Congo into Uganda and South Sudan, into Ethiopia and Uganda and so on, and seeing sort of because so far that's not something we've tried. So right now a big focus on this is really sort of to look at the difference of displacement crises and displacement axes that are present in East Africa, as we already have sort of West Africa covered, and then sort of move on from there. But a lot of it is essentially also dependent on the quality of displacement data in these contexts. And for example, in DR Congo, I know there are some challenges with the sort of the quality of the data. So yeah, I think that's the plans.
Fantastic, thank you very much. There aren't any further questions from the floor, and in any case, we're 2 minutes away from being at time. So I guess just to remind everyone, as Ed's put into the chat, to keep an eye out for the guidance package for anticipatory action and conflict through the START Fund that we will be circulating after the call, and also with the session to kind of present and go a bit more in detail into the product on the 8th of June. Aside from that, I think just to say thank you to all of our speakers. I think it's been really interesting to hear not just about the success stories, but also some of the challenges that come inherently to trying to work in advance of conflict events. So it's been great to hear about a few different approaches and ways of kind of trying to work around that and work with the data that we have available to be able to try and act earlier. And thank you, of course, to everybody who's joined online. I can see the numbers are slightly lower than when we started. I imagine people have had to drop off for calls, but thank you to those who've been able to join. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Millie. Thanks to the FOREWARN community.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Merci. Bonne suite des temps. Bye.
Bye.